Atherosclerosis, the plaques that build up, the number one killer of humans. It kills more people than cancer. And all the current standard of care in clinical medicine right now, things like cholesterol lowering, is all just disease slowing.
Welcome, everybody. This is Longevity Roadmap. I'm Buck Joffrey. Today, interesting conversation. We're going to take a little bit of a different perspective. Usually, as you know, we're interviewing people who are down in the trenches, people who are doing research on some of the fundamentals of longevity. But all of this stuff has to get paid for, and more of that is coming from the private sector. Because of that, I wanted to get that perspective. I'm joined by Dr. Karl Pfleger, who's a very thoughtful guy in the space, an investor. And this is, I think, a really important podcast because, again, we tend to dive really into the weeds, but I think it's important to understand where the money's going, because wherever the money is going is probably where you're going to see some material translation of the basic science into actual actionable things. Exciting conversation. Lots of, I think you'll come from this conversation with some hopeful feelings about the future. Anyway, check it out. We'll have that interview right after these messages.
Hey, longevity enthusiasts, it's time to take it to the next level. I've been fine-tuning my longevity regimen for years, and I look better and feel better than I did a decade ago. In fact, my blood work is even better than it was back then. And it's all because of my data-driven regimen, and it's inspired me to create a course and community just for you. It's called the Longevity Roadmap, and I urge you to check it out. If you're tired of your belly fat, tired of being tired, or just want to optimize yourself for the next 50 years, visit longevityroadmap.com. That's longevityroadmap.com.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today, my guest on Longevity Roadmap is Dr. Karl Pfleger, one of the most thoughtful investors in the longevity space. He has a Stanford PhD in machine learning, spent years at Google, then shifted his focus entirely to aging science. He's not just writing checks, he's also the creator of agingbiotech.info, which has become the go-to map of companies, conferences, and resources driving the field forward. His goal is to accelerate progress by showing how smart capital can shape the future of longevity. Karl, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So as we were talking a little bit offline, this is a little departure from what we usually do on the show because, we really usually dive deep into cutting edge, basic science of longevity, try to separate the nonsense from the real stuff. And you're doing that sort of on at a scale that puts your money behind it, right? So you had the option to stay in mainstream biotech, but you chose to focus specifically on longevity. From an investor's perspective, what makes this feel different enough to build an entire thesis around it?
Well, traditionally, the whole idea of biopharma, the whole healthcare industry, is to detangle the biology of specific diseases and develop, therapeutics and or diagnostics for them. And that's great, and the world has worked that way for quite a while. And there is a lot of disease-specific biology, and occasionally those efforts that are disease-specific do go back far enough to find some biology that's actually relevant to other diseases as well. But the aging longevity field, the underlying hypothesis, the geroscience hypothesis, which is really not so much a hypothesis anymore, more of a paradigm now, it's pretty clear, is that there's shared underlying biology that's upstream earlier temporally than all the disease-specific biology for all the chronic age-related diseases. And it's a whole different paradigm that's really going to upend the entire healthcare industry, since the majority of by vast amounts, the majority of death is caused by the chronic age-related diseases. The majority of suffering is caused by the chronic age-related diseases. 85% of people in the U.S. who die as a result of age-related chronic diseases. 90% in developed worlds altogether. 70% globally. Over 40 million people a year. Over 100,000 people a day. And suffering-wise, it's just as bad. So it's kind of absurd that most of the whole medical field and pharma industry does this stuff on a disease specific basis, when really, like, this is the thing to concentrate on. So I mean, I think from an investment point of view, it's going to be very, very lucrative, but from a philanthropic point of view, or philanthrocapitalism point of view, it's also very compelling. The just the purely capitalistic argument is that normally biotech startups have this sort of they have the same trade-off as any startup. It's a very, very small, it's like a lottery ticket, or it is a very small chance of success for a bag of gold if you succeed. And that's sort of the normal startup investing thing. And it's always, of course, for investors, the difficulty is weighing this small chance versus this big pot of gold. It's like a high numerator, high denominator thing. Does it come out above one or below one? Who knows? It's difficult. But with the idea of going after aging biology, you theoretically have multiple pots of gold, because if it works for the one indication, your chance of success is about the same as any other biotech. But then if it works, you can label expand, or physicians can start prescribing off label, and you can potentially treat 5-10 different diseases. And so, every different therapeutic is potentially pipeline in a pill.
Obviously, I agree with you on the idea of an upstream mechanism or mechanisms that ultimately are responsible for the vast majority of age-related disease. But even that is somewhat, there's a lot of different areas within that upstream area, right? Whether you're talking about immunology, whether you're talking about mitochondrial health, whether you're talking about, mTOR pathways and sirtuins or whatever. When you look at that, how do you look at those moving parts and kind of, decide, what's investable right now?
Okay, so let me unpack your question from two different angles, because there's an important point I want to make that's a broader point, right? So you allude to the fact that aging isn't one thing. It's actually a bunch of different molecular processes that slowly accumulate over time as we age. Mitochondria, and there's competing breakdowns of these, the hallmarks of aging, the SENS areas. Maybe none of them are exactly perfect, but everybody generally agrees there's like 5 to 15 kind of somewhat distinguishable different sub-pathologies. So you asked about sort of how I picked those, but let me also make the broader comment that there's general agreement about that, but it's amazing how often in the field people forget that it's not just this one monolithic thing. And sometimes people, this is a horse that I get on a lot this particular year. There's a lot of people who think of the longevity field as only about extending lifespan, and that the only thing that counts as a longevity therapeutic is something that can extend lifespan by itself. But there are a few approaches to slowing down metabolism, calorie restriction, mTOR inhibition, some other CR mimetics that can affect all of these different aging sub-pathologies, make them all run slightly slower. But there's also a lot of disease, sub-pathology specific ways to address these. There are specific mitochondrial things, or things that just affect proteostasis, or things that just kill senescent cells, which may not be expected to extend longevity by themselves. It won't be until we can array at least one therapeutic, if not more than one, for every part of the body for each one of these sub-pathologies. So it becomes this combinatorial problem. Not enough people in the field acknowledge the potential divide and conquer approach to the field. And I think that's important. So then back to your question about how do I specifically sort of prioritize these, I think each one of these, like, that's the thing. You have to actually fix all of these sub-pathologies to really fix aging. So the key is to have at least one therapeutic approach that you think has got a decent chance of succeeding in each one. So, I tend to approach my investing in the aging longevity biotech area from a philanthrocapitalistic kind of mentality. I'm doing it for the world as well as for, just making sure money comes back to keep sustaining the effort and fund philanthropy. And so I try to arrange my portfolio where I take, try to have at least a shot on goal or two at each of the important areas. And so I think that a lot of the areas are ripe. I mean, obviously epigenetic reprogramming has attracted huge amounts of attention. It's actually attracted so much money, I actually don't feel like I need my money too much there. But I have several there. I made several bets in that area long before Altos came along and New Limit came along. But companies like Shift Bio and Turn. And then I think senescent cells are super important, and killing them is very viable. And I've got 3 companies in my portfolio in that area, and I think there's the idea that senescent cells are good is overdone, and not, senescent cells are good, but only transiently. It's not clear that there's any benefit to long-lived senescent cells, and so senolytics are still a perfectly viable idea. Stem cells are another one of my favorite areas. I think there's a lot of really good data coming out there, and we finally are having, it's not all a wild west of offshore, clinics that are unapproved. We've actually got, approvals through the FDA and other regulatory national bodies. And then there's lots of interesting work in the stem cell area on the signaling molecules that come off the stem cells instead of actually the stem cells themselves as a delivery injectable therapeutic themselves. So et cetera. So, you go down the list, and, every different type of damage. One way that people think about the field is, does this category of therapeutic extend lifespan? Right now, given the baseline that we start with, the average, member of the U.S. public. Another way to think about it is, if we solve every other problem, which would this particular problem limit lifespans? It's sort of the, whether it extends lifespans now or not, it's the, if we wanted to fully rejuvenate everybody back to the biology of their 20s, young adulthood, this repeat biology, right? And we wanted to be able to do that repeatedly so that nobody ever suffered any of the ill effects of adult biological aging. Nobody who ever had the biology of current 50 plus, 60 plus year olds. The question is, would some particular molecular sub-pathology eventually cause that kind of degeneration in age-related pathology if we didn't fix it? So that's one sort of way to sort of, so something might be slow enough accumulating that it only affects 110 plus year olds, in which case it's not really a problem right now. But if we do want to sort of think about the long term, you can think, do we need eventually a solution to that problem? And, those maybe have lower priority at the moment, but they're worth thinking about how we would then solve them.
Curious how you view, I guess, when you're investing in this field, I would imagine you would have some sort of theory or thesis on how we get around this problem over the next couple of decades, right? And my friend Aubrey de Grey, as you probably know, Aubrey's talked about longevity escape velocity. Is the concept of longevity escape velocity the one that you use kind of as your framework?
Sure. I fully believe in longevity escape velocity. I think it's pretty inevitable, right? We're all just molecules. Humanity is getting better and better at manipulating molecules. I don't believe there's anything that's not just a molecular state that is needed to fix everything. So eventually it'll happen. It's anybody's guess exactly how fast that happens, but obviously we can prioritize the thing. So, for example, 2 of my portfolio companies are the only 2 companies in existence, as far as I know, that have disease-modifying reversal of atherosclerosis, right? So atherosclerosis, the plaques that build up, the number one killer of humans. It kills more people than cancer. And all the current standard of care in clinical medicine right now, things like cholesterol lowering, is all just disease slowing, right? It doesn't fix the plaques. So 2 companies in the field, both of which grew out of Aubrey's, to one of the companies like Clarity is people from the SENS Research Foundation who founded it, and the other company Repair Bio is Reason, who was one of Aubrey and SENS's biggest cheerleaders. Those 2 companies both have therapeutics in the works that can reverse atherosclerotic plaques. And Clarity is already in phase 1 trials in Australia, and Repair is in preclinical, but they've got lots of late-stage preclinical data, and it looks really good. And so I expect them to start clinical trials soon. And so, obviously, fixing that pushes the LEB a little bit. And then, I try to invest primarily in all these things that are going to have these big effects initially, while sort of paying attention to those other things that are going to be needed, and also paying a little bit of attention to what's already getting a lot of money and what's not getting enough money. And so, for example, for a long time, and even still now, problems with the extracellular matrix, the ECM, have not gotten enough research, and nobody really knows how to drug it and how to break crosslinks. And so I had two companies in my portfolio that are working on that. The one that's farther along is probably Rebel Pharmaceuticals, and they have some great enzyme engineering in order to break crosslinks, that some of which, basically don't have any normal way for human DNA to create an enzyme to break those. And so, I think there will eventually be progress there, but we need more. We need more shots on goal.
The problem is that the shots on goal are almost infinite. Like if you look at, just in doing this podcast, I constantly hear about a new angle, right? And who knows if it's a real thing or not. Just as an example, I spoke to the discoverer of the telomerase gene a week or two ago. And I didn't really think the telomerase lengthening thesis was really something to pay much attention to anymore. There's just been too much, I don't know, there's just too much noise there. But afterwards, after I talked to him, I was pretty convinced that there was something there. It's just kind of sort of a never ending, now what? And I can look at it,
Telomerase has gone through this sort of classic hype cycle where there was a period of time where everybody thought it was the key to aging and it was the only thing that mattered, and blah blah, and that crashed down, but it probably crashed down too far to people thinking isn't important. And now we're finally coming back up to this sort of, okay, yeah, actually there's something there. And I think absolutely we're going to need a way to extend telomeres, and I have one company in my portfolio that does that with mRNA, and I think it's going to be great. And there's lots of good data on telomerase and things like IPF. So yeah, it seems very clear. It interacts with cell senescence. But even if you have some way to kill senescent cells, you're going to need a way to extend telomeres in order to keep stem cells active.
Right.
Eventually.
Right. And then you have, discussions of regeneration of the thymus gland, right? Like, and then you end up, there's just like an infinite number of things where, I shouldn't say infinite because I'm sure it's not infinite, but to me it seems that way. But that you just look at it and you're like, well, yeah, but that's almost like, programmatic death, right? If we run out of this, certain number of immune cells over time, how are you going to live? Are you going to, so it just kind of keeps going, but it's an interesting area, I just think, to look at. But let me ask you this. So go ahead.
Your comment about how do you deal with this new things keep coming along goes exactly back to your previous question about LEV, right? We know there are some sub-pathologies that are clearly impacting lifespans now because they're creating high risk of multiple age-related diseases. So we know we need to fix those. So we should just get on with doing that. And when we do, people will be living a little bit longer, and then we'll see which of these other pathologies that we didn't maybe have on our radar have high enough priority and then need attention. And that's the whole LEV idea. And I think, clearly. So, for example, atherosclerosis, like I mentioned, I think there is good data that thymic involution is probably bad for you. There's still some debate about that. But et cetera. Senescent cells clearly play a role. Kirkland's got a slide with 20 plus diseases. So there's things we know we need to fix. We don't have to get the laundry list exactly perfect now. We just need to have the top priority ones get enough shots on goal that some of them succeed clinically.
One of the biggest challenges in proving a therapy works in humans is that, waiting 30 years, 40 years. So what kinds of methods are you using to, I guess, shortcut that issue? Is there blood tests or anything like that you're relying on yourself for some of these outcomes and using it as a surrogate for lifespan? I look at that and I'm like, boy, that'd be a real challenge if you want to invest in something like this. So
yeah, this is a big issue in the field that I think the field often doesn't. Some people in the field have discussions that don't appropriately acknowledge the challenge of the human long lifespans and getting the data right. And it's frustrating how often you see, like, Eric Topol just had a post where on vitamins, and he wrote this paragraph that said, experts have told me that there are no long-term randomized controlled trials in humans with high enough N that prove that any vitamin extends human lifespan. Like, of course there aren't. You can't have long-term randomized control trials in human at the duration of their lifespan, especially with high end. Like, that's just completely impractical. So here's the thing that I wrote up a thing, and it's on my social media. People find me on Twitter or LinkedIn. There's a version of this, a post on both of them, right? The best we can do, right? Here's the three things that we want from data, ideally. We want long-term data. Well, we care about long-term health here. We want long-term relative to lifespan data. And that should trump short-term endpoints, right? Ideally, short-term relative to lifespan endpoints. So we want long-term data. We want randomized data instead of observational data, ideally. We want to prefer it. And we want data in humans. So three things in humans over animal models, model species, right? So long-term, randomized in humans. Well, this is a choose two of the three. The thing is, you can't, all three is not impossible, but we're not going to have it for decades, even if we started it now. And it's economically impractical. So we can't have all three, but this is one of those situations where any two of those three, we have in many areas, we have lots of data on, right? So we have randomized controlled data on non-humans, long-term relative to lifespan. You just choose either one of those three and you can leave it out. And we have good examples of data. So the best we could do is for any given area that we care about, whether it's, some lifestyle in modification we're thinking about or some new therapeutic, right? We try to triangulate as much data as we can from each of the three areas that leaves one of those three desirable things out. And then if all three of the things point in the same direction, that gives us some good. So for on social media, for example, I looked at protein, low protein versus high protein, and I booked that. But even for new therapeutics, right? So you start out with, the model species. So you have mice or you have some other model species, and you look at how the data works for that particular area of biology and therapeutic approach. And then try to gather whatever data you might have in humans. Maybe there are some relevant biomarkers that you can mine for epidemiological data, et cetera. And so, and then you proceed through clinical trials, which don't take 30 years. They only take 5 to 10 years, depending. And then, you start getting people using it, and hopefully that's great. And you monitor them afterward. In the meantime, the search is on for biomarkers to try and short circuit this process. And we have aging clocks and we have other biomarkers. And, the aging clocks aren't really ready to be full surrogate endpoints for a longevity lifespan trial yet, but they are getting better. And they're already good enough to be better than using chronological age for some of the purposes in which chronological age is already used clinically. So I think progress is happening there.
I'm curious, just a discussion on the aging clocks, because it's been, that's an area that I think a lot of longevity people, longevity hackers, or whatever you want to call them, are really relying on. But in most cases, they're neither, specific or accurate. And so, is there some clocks that you think are, for some reason, worth relying on a little bit more?
There's a lot of misinformation about aging clocks. So in general, they are better for populations, which is good for studies, than they are for individual use, right? So because there's a noise. And so they're not as good for, I'm going to take one data point using one clock, and then I'm going to change something about my life. And then I'm going to take another data point. Like, there's too much variability there. But that doesn't mean that you can't run a trial with 500 people or 1,000 people in each the treatment and control group. That evens out a lot of the noise. So that's one thing. There are a number of improvements that have been made to aging clocks over the last 5 years. A number of problems have been identified with the clocks, with fixes to those problems, and not all those fixes have been incorporated into all of the clocks. So it's fashionable these days to try and test as many clocks as you can and look at a consensus. I don't think that's a very good approach. What we want are new clocks that take into account all of the showstopper problems that have been identified. So here's 3 that have happened recently. Several years ago, Morgan Levine's lab, then at Yale, she's now at Altos, identified the test-retest variability, because a lot of the clocks would look at hundreds and hundreds or 1,000 plus CPG sites, the methylation clocks, and then they would boil them down, they would do this feature selection process, and they would boil them down to only a few CPG sites. But there's enough noise in the CPG site measurement that what would happen then is you could take the same blood tests or sample tests, whether it was saliva or whatever, and and run it twice through your machine, and you would get widely different answers. And they came up with a fix for this, the sort of principal components thing. And you test more CPG sites, it evens out, and then basically you fix that problem. And the problem is not all the clocks actually have that fix. The best ones do, but not all. That was several years ago. And then more recently, in Eric Burden's lab at the Buck, Alan Tomusiak, one of his grad students, there are different cell types running around in the blood. There's especially very different, a bunch of different immune cell types. And some of those, it turns out, have, according to these CPG site clocks, are sort of inherently younger than some of the other cell types in the immune system. And sometimes when you get an illness or something else changes, the ratio of those different immune cell types changes. And so you can get this situation, which is sort of, you can call, in statistics, they call it Simpson's paradox, but where you call it mixed changes in general, where maybe all the cells in the blood don't change in their age, a relative proportion of the young ones or the old ones changes, and as a result, the average looks like it changes. And so you can fix that out by dividing the cells by their different types. And so they came up with these phrases, intrinsic age and extrinsic age. And very few of the clocks available today, direct to consumer for the biohackers, actually have that broken out. But you can do it, and it's coming. And I'm sure all of them will end up breaking that out eventually. But right now, that's sort of like, that means all the sort of first and second generation clocks aren't trustworthy with respect to immune cell type niche changes, if you just happen to have a cold recently or whatever. And then the third thing that happened recently is Vadim Vladishev's lab helped detangle that some of the CPG sites, some of the changes in the epigenome are compensatory or downstream of some causal chain, but others are actually on the causal chain themselves. Like that change happens, and that as a result of that change, you are older, or some aging pathology is driven. And so they detangled the causal ones versus the non-causal ones and came up with clocks that only are based on the causal ones, for example. So when all of those things are incorporated into the new clocks all together, and when we've gone several years without some new showstopper idea showing what was wrong with the current clocks, then that's the time where I believe the clocks will be good. But it's important to know the clocks are already really good. Like chronological age is a pretty good. So let's take a step back. Chronological age is super important for predicting chronic age-related risk, right? If you look at the top risk factors for heart disease and cancer and a whole bunch of other things, it's like all the things people think about, like cholesterol and smoking, and then aging, what your chronological age is dominates. It's like so much more important of a biomarker of your risk. And yet the aging clocks, the good aging clocks, are already at the point where they can out-predict chronological age in terms of predicting the risk of age-related disease or predicting mortality. So we're already at the point where maybe clinical medicine should actually be using these aging clocks alongside or instead of chronological age for some of the reasons, some of the ways that we use that. For example, diagnostic screening criteria for colonoscopies, or who should get a booster shot, who's at higher risk for various conditions that have vaccines with boosters. There's all these thresholds on chronological age. Probably we would reduce risk if we actually took into account even just the current best aging clocks.
Yeah, definitely. What gets you really, really excited? Give me like a couple of topics that when you hear about them right now and where you're sitting from, you're like, wow, I love that. That is going to be big.
You can refine your question if this doesn't answer your question. But the thing that gets me most excited right now is that, the wider public does not realize how important the aging and longevity field is. They don't. The public doesn't realize it, and government funding doesn't recognize it, right? 85% plus of humans who die in the U.S. die as a result of age-related pathology, but the NIH budget devoted to aging biology is less than 1%. So there's a huge mismatch there. And the public is going to get behind this at some point when they realize that it's the only way to save Social Security and Medicare from bankruptcy and solve the demographic disaster that we're on the way to, the silver tsunami. That hasn't happened yet. it's a big question. What is the thing that is going to convince the majority of the public? And probably it's going to be many things. But one of the things that gets me most excited is that the field is reaching a really exciting point. The next 5 to 10 years are going to be super exciting. So roughly speaking, if you look at, there were centuries of science where we looked at disease-specific biology. And then in the last few decades is where the sort of biology of aging in academia has really come of its, made big breakthroughs. But that didn't start generating biotech startups that were really trying to translate these new discoveries into things that millions of people could use until about the mid-2010s. Well, it on average takes about 10 years to get through clinical trials to approval from a new biotech founding. So mid-2010s, well, it's 2025 right now. What does that mean? Oh, look, it's been about 10 years since the very earliest, some of the earliest ones. What's actually happening? Well, for some reason, this narrative is underappreciated in the field, even amongst the top scientists, even in terms of discussions that happen at the top conferences. But if you look at the, as my website, agingbiotech.info does in its companies table, right, if you look at the hundreds of biotechs that are really looking at these core aging sub-pathologies and trying to bring things to market with them, there's hundreds of them. There's 300 or 400, but there's not that many that are actually in late stage clinical trials yet. But there are some, because some of them started in the late 2010s. So it turns out if you look at just the approvals and the phase 3 clinical trials of drugs that really embody the geroscience hypothesis, there's a lot going on. And this is the vanguard of the field, right? There are a couple areas where drugs have actually gotten through to FDA approval. There are another 15 or so in phase 3. And with a greater than 50% success rate in phase 3, that means that in the next several years, we're going to have another half dozen at least approvals. And then there's 30 plus phase 2s coming behind those. So we're actually at the vanguard of a whole bunch of things actually getting to market that are fundamentally different from the majority of pharmaceutical approvals in that they address biology that's not specific to a single disease, which means we're going to start years after the approvals, we're going to start getting label expansions where they get approved for multiple other diseases, and or the physicians are going to realize the biology, it might apply to their patients who have slightly different diseases and are going to start prescribing them off label. When that happens, and that's sometime in the next 5 to 10 years, when that happens, it's a whole new world. Like, everyone's going to pay attention and realize that this field is the next big thing.
You can kind of almost see that a little bit with GLP-1s right now.
That's right. So the idea is, GLP-1s are even worse than what's coming because, it's not clear yet, but so far all the data on GLP-1 drugs is only in people who are overweight or obese. And it's clear that being overweight or obese speeds aging. So it's possible that all the benefit from GLP-1 drugs is just to undo that speed up of aging. It's also possible that they really do affect mitochondria in some way that will even affect people who stay lean their whole lives. But there's no data supporting that yet. And so the new things that are coming along, some of them are going to work even for people who weren't overweight or obese ever and didn't have that particular accelerated aging pathology. And so I think that there's a lot of things coming along that have more evidence that they're going to affect 100% of the population and not just the overweight portion.
Karl, thank you so much for the conversation. It's been really fascinating. Again, the site is agingbiotech.info, sort of the go-to map of companies, conferences, and resources driving this field forward. Thank you for everything you do.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening. A quick reminder that while I am, in fact, a surgeon, nothing I say should be construed as medical advice. Now, make sure to include your physician in any medical decisions you make. And also, if you're enjoying the show, please make sure to show your support with a like, share, or subscribe.